Imagine stepping back to a time when the very earth beneath your feet dictated your destiny. A time when the cycle of seasons was not merely a charming spectacle, but the foundation of life itself. We are talking about medieval England, a land painted with rolling hills, sprawling forests, and quaint villages, each a microcosm of a complex social order. And at the heart of it all, taxation. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Taxation. Yawn. But trust me, the story of medieval taxes is far more captivating than it sounds. There were no income taxes, no sales taxes, no property taxes as we know them. Instead, taxes were deeply intertwined with feudal obligations. It was all about land, labor, and the king's due. On the contrary, they recognized its value as a reliable source of income and continued to collect it. However, they also implemented their own systems and innovations. Gradually transforming the landscape of taxation, it's a tale of power, survival, and the constant tug-of-war between the crown and the common folk. At first, the levy was based on the honor system, and then later it was based on land value and head count. In reality, this was just a tax to raise money quickly. This all changed with Henry I. He was the first to realize that the tax could be more effective with a more organized means of assessment. He sent out royal officials into the areas who would ensure that all the taxes were being correctly assigned. In most cases, this was determined by the value of the land. It's a story etched into the very landscape, whispered in the rustling leaves of ancient forests, and echoing in the crumbling stones of long-forgotten castles. Before we dive into the specifics, let's set the stage. Medieval England operated under what we call the feudal system. Think of it as a pyramid, with the king at the very top, holding ultimate authority. This wasn't a new invention of the medieval period. It had roots stretching back to the Anglo-Saxon kings, long before the Norman conquest. The Geld was essentially a land tax levy based on the value and productivity of the land. It was a way for the king to generate revenue, primarily to fund the defense of the realm against Viking raids and other threats. Below him were the nobles, powerful landowners who swore loyalty to the king, promising military service in exchange for vast estates. Beneath the nobles were the vassals. And finally, at the very bottom, the vast majority of the population, the peasants. These peasants were the backbone of the entire system. They were the farmers, the laborers, the ones who toiled tirelessly from dawn till dusk, cultivating the land and producing the food that sustained everyone above them in the pyramid. In exchange for their labor, they were granted the right to live on the land and receive protection from their lord. But this protection came at a price. And that price, my friends, was taxation. Now, it's crucial to understand that medieval taxation was very different from what we know today, initially. One of the most significant forms of taxation was the Geld. When William the Conqueror and his Norman lords arrived in 1066, they didn't abolish the Geld. But let's not imagine this was all calculated with charts and spreadsheets. One of the most basic forms of taxation was simply the provision of food and labor. Peasants were obligated to work a certain number of days each year on the lord's land, cultivating his fields, harvesting his crops, and performing other essential tasks. But the reality was often far more brutal. The peasants were essentially tied to the land, unable to leave without the lord's permission. Their lives were dictated by the needs of the manor, and they had little say in how they were governed or how their labor was used. This was known as week work or boon work, and it was a fundamental part of the feudal agreement. It also freed up the nobles to focus on managing their estates and doing other things they cared about. Of course, it also brought in a lot of money for the crown. This was basically a land tax based on the number of plough teams, or carucages, that a landholder had. It was meant to be a fairer and more efficient way of measuring land value than the old geld system. The carucage was mainly used to fund Richard's military campaigns, including the Third Crusade. It was a system that shaped the lives of everyone from the king to the lowest peasant. It brought in money, funded wars, and kept the social order going. But it was also a system that could be unfair and heavily disliked, and as we'll see in the next section. This frustration would eventually grow into major social and political upheaval. As the medieval period went on, other forms of taxation began to emerge, reflecting the changing needs of the monarchy and the growing complexity of the economy. The church also played a big role in the medieval tax system. Well, the church had its ways of dealing with that. If the villagers refused to pay, church officials would visit them. If they still didn't pay, they could be excommunicated. For a villager in medieval England, this meant they were kicked out of the Christian community and out of heaven. No one in the village would speak to them, and they were basically cast out. Every Christian had to pay a tithe, which was 10% of their yearly produce or income. This tithe was supposed to help the local parish priest keep the church building in good shape and help the poor. This was a smart idea that allowed knights and nobles to avoid their traditional duty of military service. Instead of personally leading their men into battle, they could pay the king a fee, which he would then use to hire professional soldiers, unlike scutage, which was usually paid by nobles. Tallage was a direct tax on regular people. It was often forced and imposed without the agreement of those being taxed, making it a source of strong resentment. Kings like Henry III and Edward I often used tallage to pay for their wars and other expensive plans. They also had to provide a portion of their own harvest to the lord, ensuring that he had enough to feed his household and his soldiers. It's easy to romanticize this to imagine a harmonious exchange between lord and peasant. However, it wasn't all about forced labor and agricultural produce. One such tax was scutage, which means shield money. Scutage had several advantages. It gave the king a more reliable land, flexible military force, allowing him to send troops wherever they were most needed. Another important tax was tallage, which was mainly charged to towns and people living on royal lands. And then there was carucage, a tax introduced by King Richard I, Richard the Lionheart, in 1194. But it wasn't just the king who wanted his share. Now, I know what you're thinking. What happens when a villager doesn't pay their tithe to the church? As you can see, medieval taxation was a complicated and layered system, deeply woven into the structure of feudal society. Picture medieval England, lords in shining armor, serfs working in the fields. But behind this romantic image lies a complicated system of early taxation. Today, we're diving deep into that history, exploring how the English monarchy started to gain financial independence through clever and sometimes controversial methods. Before we had income tax, property tax, or even VAT, the main source of royal income came from something called the feudal system. Now, it doesn't sound very exciting, does it? But this land-based tax, passed down from the Anglo-Saxon kings, was the base on which the entire financial structure of the kingdom was built. Every piece of land was judged, and its owner had to pay a certain amount to the crown. The growing use of scutage also showed a shift away from feudal armies toward a more organized and trained one, a change that would have major long-term effects. Unlike scutage, it didn't involve soldiers or service. Tallage was simply a direct tax that the king could demand whenever he wanted. Then, the king's men show up, asking for a tallage. Carucage was the land tax, but instead of judging land by its value, It was based on how many plough teams or carucages a landowner had. Carucage replaced the old geld and was meant to be a more modern system. But, like most taxes, it wasn't always welcomed. Landowners complained about fairness. Why should someone with good land and strong oxen pay the same as someone with poor soil and weak animals? This project recorded the value of every church property in England and Wales. These early taxes, scutage, tallage, carucage. Tithes tell us a lot about how the monarchy and people interacted, and how they led to one of the biggest uprisings in English history. Until then, keep asking those great historical questions. They show the constant need for money, the growing power of kings, and how unfair taxes led to frustration. They also show how seeds of rebellion were planted seeds that would grow into future revolts. It's now an important historical record that shows how rich and powerful the church really was. Think of it as a tax on farming power, on the tools that made food. A chunk of your hard-earned money is gone, and you're left wondering how to feed your family and keep your shop running. You can see why people were angry. And by whenever he wanted, we really mean whenever he needed more money. Simple, right. It worked, but it wasn't always fair. It was an easy way to get money without asking Parliament because Parliament didn't really exist yet. This lack of permission made tallage very unpopular. People saw it as unfair. Even like being robbed by the crown. Remember that hierarchy. King, nobles, vassals, peasants. Well, everyone had a part to play, not just in war, but in keeping the royal treasury full. At the very beginning, after the Norman conquest in 1066, the main source of money was the geld. The most famous church tax was the tithe, a required payment, usually 10% of your yearly crops or income, given to the local church. If you didn't pay, you could face serious punishments, even be kicked out of the church. Imagine being rejected by your whole town, not allowed to join religious events, and being told you were going to hell, all for not giving 10% of your grain. A get-out-of-jail-free card, you might say, for military service. This money scutage let the king hire pro-soldiers, or mercenaries, who were probably more reliable and ready than the often reluctant noble armies. Think of it like outsourcing your army. For the king, it was a smart way to gather a loyal, professional fighting force, the geld, and to scutage, a word that might make you think of medieval battles, and you wouldn't be far off. Scutage, or shield money, came from a very practical problem. Knights, who were supposed to serve in the king's army, sometimes preferred to, well, not fight. All that armor, the travel, the chance of, dying. It wasn't everyone's idea of a good time. So, what could they do? They could pay a fee. But scutage wasn't perfect. It was often demanded without warning, and nobles didn't like paying for something they were already expected to do. Then we have tallage. Tallage was a tax placed mostly on towns and people who lived on royal lands. Kings like Henry III and Edward I, always needing cash for wars and buildings, loved tallage. Now, imagine you're a small-town merchant. You've had a decent year, sold some goods at the market, and are finally making a little profit. Another early type of tax was carucage. King Richard I, also called Richard the Lionheart, started it in 1194. Richard, always needing money for his crusades and battles, wanted a fast and fair way to collect it. Of course, we can't forget the church. The medieval church was incredibly rich and powerful, and it played a big role in the tax system. The tithe wasn't just about money. It was seen as a religious duty, a way to get to heaven and keep society in order. To collect these tithes properly, The church started a huge survey called the Taxatio Ecclesiastica in the late 13th century. So, what's the big idea here? But that's a story for another time. Next time, we'll look at the effects of medieval taxes on everyday people. In the mosaic of medieval taxation, few taxes were as closely tied to the land and its crops as carucage. Picture the rolling English countryside, with villages tucked between fields ready for planting. This is where the story of carucage really begins. Brought in by Richard I, also known as Richard the Lionheart in the late 12th century, this tax changed how the crown collected money. Unlike older land taxes, carucage was tied to how productive the land was, judged by the number of plough teams, or carucates, a landowner had. One carucate was the amount of land a team of 8 oxen could plough in one farming season. It was one of the first serious attempts to make land taxes more fair and based on actual work and results. Back then, the church wasn't just about religion. This was a required payment, usually 10% of someone's yearly crops or income. Given to support the church and its workers, it brought in a lot of money, which helped the church stay strong and active in every part of society. People believed this. Payment was a duty given by God, something every Christian had to do. If someone didn't pay, they could be punished spiritually, like being kicked out of the church. The crown sometimes charged the church taxes to get money from its wealth. It touched every part of life from fields and farms to churches and castles. As we go forward in history, we'll see how this heavy burden and the unfairness it created began to weaken the old feudal system. To handle this, the church did its own land surveys to check the value of its lands and make sure that taxes were fair. One big example of this is the Taxatio Ecclesiastica, a full survey of church properties in England and Wales made in the late 13th century. It gave a complete record of what the church owned and how much it was worth. This helped set fair tax amounts. The taxatio is still very useful for historians today. It shows just how rich and powerful the church was in medieval times. That was a huge deal in a time when religion ruled daily life. Others accused church leaders of being greedy and wasting the money they collected. But even with these complaints, the church stayed a central part of the tax system and held onto its money and power. It was also a rich and powerful part of daily life, owning lots of land and having strong influence over everyone, from kings to peasants. Because of that, it had a big part in the tax system both as a collector and a receiver of money. Some peasants didn't like giving part of their small crops to the church, especially when times were hard or food was scarce. It showed that the crown was beginning to understand the need for better ways to raise money from the land. It was an early step toward building a modern financial system in England. Think of it like a tax on farming power, a direct tax on the land's ability to grow food and make money. The more plough teams the landowner had, the more crops they could grow, and the higher their carucage tax would be. This method was meant to be fairer than older systems that used rough guesses about land value. With carucage, the idea was to base the tax on how much food and money the land could really produce. But in real life, things didn't always go as planned. The job of collecting carucage came with a lot of problems. Counting and judging every plough team in the kingdom needed large surveys and lots of records. Soil quality, hills, and local farming styles all made a difference. What was a full day's work with oxen in one place might be something else in another, which led to unfair taxes across regions, even with all these issues. Carucage stayed an important tax for a while, especially during Richard's rule. The money raised helped pay for his military actions, including the Third Crusade. Royal officials had to go to each village, check every farm, and write down their findings. This took a lot of time and work, and mistakes were common. Some landowners likely hid their plough teams to lower their taxes, while others were unfairly taxed because of bad surveys. Also, the meaning of carucage could change depending on where you were in the country. However, carucage didn't last very long. Later kings moved on to other ways of taxing people. Still, its legacy matters now. Let's look at another major player in the medieval tax world, the church, the most famous church. Tax was the tithe. The church used the tithe to fund many things, building and fixing churches and cathedrals, paying priests and monks, helping the poor, and running schools and hospitals. But collecting the tithe wasn't always smooth. Fights often happened between villagers and church leaders about how much should be paid or how to pay it. Besides tithes, the church also had to deal with taxes on its lands. The church's role in taxes didn't go unchallenged. Some people said the church had too much money and should do more to help everyone. The mix of religion and money shaped the medieval tax world. Now, let's delve into a fascinating document, the Taxatio Ecclesiastica. This wasn't a tax itself, but rather a detailed survey ordered by the Church, especially under Pope Nicholas IV. Way back in 1291 and 1292, think of it as the Church's version of the Domesday Book. Imagine church scribes traveling the countryside, visiting monasteries, cathedrals, parish churches, and small chapels. For each place, they wrote down how much income it brought in from things like land rent, tithes that important 10% people gave, donations, and even money made from mills and businesses the church owned. It was a giant project that needed many people and lots of time, and the result is a goldmine for historians today. Remember, tithes were mandatory 10% of your produce or income each year. By tracking where the church's income came from, the taxatio shows how much the church was part of the local economy. In many towns, the church wasn't just a religious place, it was also a landowner, an employer, and even a provider of schools and care. The taxatio shows both the good and the heavy side of this relationship. While they were supposed to help the local priest and maintain the church, a good portion often went up the church chain. The taxatio records the value of these tithes in detail, helping us see both how much pressure they put on people and how much the church depended on them. And it only gives us a moment in time. Things like harvests and prices could change fast, so it doesn't always show long-term trends. Even so, the Taxatio Ecclesiastica remains one of the best tools we have to understand the church's economic power, how it was organized, and how it fit into medieval society. It's a sign of how well the church could manage its vast holdings and income. So next time you hear about medieval taxes, remember the Taxatio Ecclesiastica, a window into the church's wealth and how it shaped the medieval world. But instead of listing all lands, it carefully recorded the wealth and income of church-owned properties across England and Wales. Quite a lot, actually. First, it shows just how rich the church was. It shows how the church's wealth was split between bishops, abbots, and simple priests. It even gives hints about how local church leaders handled tax collection and how important certain parishes were. At the time, the Cistercians, known for being great at farming, often had huge sheep farms and made a lot from selling wool. The Benedictines, with their large and old abbeys, also appear often, owning big pieces of land and collecting lots of rent. This information helps historians understand what each group focused on, whether it was farming, trading, or even lending money. The Taxatio gives clues. The document reveals the church as a massive economic force, owning tons of land, controlling major resources, and bringing in a steady stream of income. This wealth wasn't spread out evenly. Some monasteries were very rich, owning big estates and grand buildings, while small churches often struggled to survive. The taxation gives us a picture of that economic gap within the church itself. But why did the church take on such a huge task? Well, the main reason was taxation, of course. The Pope needed to raise money often for crusades or other major efforts, and to do that fairly, they needed an accurate count of what the church owned and earned. Before the taxation, records were often outdated or even made smaller on purpose by local religious houses to avoid higher taxes. The taxatio ecclesiastica was meant to fix this, making a fair and clear way to charge people taxes, also called tenths. This survey gives us a close look at the church's huge land holdings. So, what does this taxatio show us about the church back then? Take the monasteries, for example. The taxatio helps us see which orders had the most money and where their wealth was located. The document also shows how important tithes were for the church's income. It also helps us understand how the church fit into village life. But the taxatio ecclesiastica isn't only about money. It also teaches us about how the church was built and run. Still, we should remember the limits of the taxatio. It only covers church-owned property, so it doesn't show what regular people owned or earned. Now, let's delve into a fascinating document, the Taxatio Ecclesiastica. This wasn't a tax itself, but rather a detailed survey ordered by the church, especially under Pope Nicholas IV. Well, the main reason was taxation, of course. Imagine church scribes traveling the countryside, visiting monasteries, cathedrals, parish churches, and small chapels. Quite a lot, actually. First, it shows just how rich the church was. The document reveals the church as a massive economic force, owning tons of land, controlling major resources, and bringing in a steady stream of income. Remember, tithes were mandatory 10% of your produce or income each year. While they were supposed to help the local priest and maintain the church, a good portion often went up the church chain. It shows how the church's wealth was split between bishops, abbots, and simple priests. It even gives hints about how local church leaders handled tax collection and how important certain parishes were at the time. The taxatio records the value of these tithes in detail, helping us see both how much pressure they put on people and how much the church depended on them. This wealth wasn't spread out evenly. Some monasteries were very rich, owning big estates and grand buildings, while small churches often struggled to survive. By tracking where the church's income came from, the taxatio shows how much the church was part of the local economy. In many towns, the church wasn't just a religious place, it was also a landowner, an employer, and even a provider of schools and care. And it only gives us a moment in time. Things like harvests and prices could change fast, so it doesn't always show long-term trends. Even so, the Taxatio Ecclesiastica remains one of the best tools we have to understand the church's economic power, how it was organized, and how it fit into medieval society. It's a sign of how well the church could manage its vast holdings and income. So next time you hear about medieval taxes, remember the Taxatio Ecclesiastica, a window into the church's wealth and how it shaped the medieval world. The taxatio shows both the good and the heavy side of this relationship. The taxatio gives us a picture of that economic gap within the church itself. For each place, they wrote down how much income it brought in from things like land rent, tithes that important 10% people gave, donations, and even money made from mills and businesses the church owned. It was a giant project that needed many people and lots of time, and the result is a goldmine for historians today. The Pope needed to raise money often for crusades or other major efforts, and to do that fairly, they needed an accurate count of what the Church owned and earned. Before the tax issue, records were often outdated or even made smaller on purpose by local religious houses to avoid higher taxes. The taxatio ecclesiastica was meant to fix this, making a fair and clear way to charge people taxes, also called tenths. Way back in 1291 and 1292. Think of it as the Church's version of the Domesday Book, but instead of listing all lands, it carefully recorded the wealth and income of church-owned properties across England and Wales. But why did the Church take on such a huge task? The Cistercians, known for being great at farming, often had huge sheep farms and made a lot from selling wool. The Benedictines, with their large and old abbeys, also appear often, owning big pieces of land and collecting lots of rent. This information helps historians understand what each group focused on, whether it was farming, trading, or even lending money. The taxatio gives clues. This survey gives us a close look at the Church's huge land holdings. So, what does this taxatio show us about the Church back then? Take the monasteries, for example. The taxatio helps us see which orders had the most money and where their wealth was located. The document also shows how important tithes were for the Church's income. It also helps us understand how the Church fit into village life. But the taxatio ecclesiastica isn't only about money. It also teaches us about how the Church was built and run. Still, we should remember the limits of the taxatio. It only covers church-owned property, so it doesn't show what regular people owned or earned. Now, let us dive into the tricky topic of who actually carried the load of these medieval taxes and who, let's just say, found ways to avoid them. It's a story of unfairness, privilege, and growing anger that sometimes exploded into full-on rebellion. Most of the burden fell on the shoulders of the poor, the peasants working in the fields and the craftsmen making tools and goods. These were the people who were constantly pressured, their small earnings and harvests taken to fill the royal treasury and fund the rich lifestyle of the elite. The big problem with the medieval tax system, just like with many tax systems throughout history, was that it wasn't applied equally. So why was this? Why didn't the nobles and church leaders, the wealthiest people, pay much? Let's break that down. The nobles were the landowners, given their lands by the king in return for loyalty and military support. This setup, called feudalism, made the king very dependent on the nobles. He needed them, especially in wartime. That seemed fair, but even then, nobles could turn round and demand more from their tenants to make up for what they paid. Imagine working all day just to feed your family, and then being told to give part of it away while the rich paid nothing and lived in luxury. Heavy taxes made it hard to save money, fix your farm, or plan for the future. The Peasants' Revolt in 1381, sparked by the poll tax, was one example. But the anger behind the revolt had been building for years because of taxes and fair rules, and the feeling that the rich didn't care about the poor. People were always one bad harvest or illness away from losing everything. That kind of unfairness builds resentment. If he taxed them too hard, they might turn against him. That was a risk he didn't want to take. That was true to some extent. But many people still felt the church wasn't paying its fair share, and they weren't quiet about it. Instead of taxing nobles directly, the king often asked them to contribute in other ways, like paying scutage, shield money, instead of going to war themselves. It was a loud call for a fairness and justice. It also forced leaders to rethink their tax policies, at least for a while. It caused suffering, deepened the gap between rich and poor, and sometimes pushed people to rise up. It may have worked for the nobles and the church, but in the long run, it hurt the whole kingdom. The weight of taxes fell hardest on the people least able to carry it, creating a world filled with injustice, frustration, and the seeds of change. As for the church, its special treatment came from its power and influence. The church owned tons of land, got rich from tithes and donations, and had great spiritual power over the people. If the king pushed the church too hard, it could fight back by excommunicating him, banning religious services, or causing political trouble. So, kings usually tried to stay on good terms with church leaders, asking them for voluntary donations instead of forcing taxes on them. The church said it deserved tax breaks because it provided important services, education, health care, helping the poor, and spiritual guidance. So, what happened because of this unequal system? A lot. First, it made poor people very angry. Second, it kept the poor stuck in poverty. Third, it made the country less stable. The revolt showed that even in a strict society, there's a limit to what people will put up with. So, the unfair tax system in medieval England had big effects.